Awesome, thank you. Welcome, everybody. This is the second part of a two-part webinar series that we're hosting this spring, and we're today talking about boundaries in practice, learning, teaching, and upholding limits. This is a webinar style presentation. I saw some questions in the chat about being able to come on audio and things like that. With this many participants, we will be the only ones able to unmute and mute ourselves as well as use video, but you guys can use the chat or the Q&A to answer or ask questions. Sometimes the chat does get going, so we lose some questions in there. So sometimes it's better to ask them in the Q&A, but if you ask them in the chat, other panel or other participants will also potentially chime in and give resources and things. So that's 100% up to you all. This is being recorded, and the recording will come to your email about an hour after the presentation ends. I do want to be really clear that we can only offer continuing education units for attending the webinar live. So if someone does watch that recording, we are unable to provide that CEU certificate for watching it. There's like a bunch of other paperwork and records that have to be maintained in order to be able to offer those education units for recordings, and that's just not something we're able to offer right now. So I did want to go ahead and say that. The way that you'll receive your CEU certificate is via survey. So there will be a survey. The link will be in the chat multiple times at the end of this. It should populate when the webinar ends on your computer. It should just like pop up as a browser that you should be able to take it in. It'll also be in the lobby of the webinar for about 30 minutes. I think that lobby stays open until 2, and then it will also be included in a follow-up email. So there's lots of ways for you guys to get the link to that survey, and then once that survey is complete, your CEU certificate will be sent to you. If you have any issues with your CEU certificate, you can reach out to the email address that Brittany will provide in the chat for any issues. You can also use like the contact us through our website option at camber.com or sorry, camber.org, and we'll be able to get that worked out for you. Other than that, I think that's most of the housekeeping items that people have questions about in the beginning. So I will turn it over to our two presenters today, which are Bethany Nold and Cheryl Costable.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. Before we jump in, we'll just do a quick introduction of us. I'm Cheryl Costable. I'm the Vice President of Residential Treatment Services for KVC, Missouri. I'm clinically licensed in the state of Kansas and Missouri. I've got training in several modalities. I spent the majority of my career in inpatient settings, 24-hour care, QRTPs, PRTFs, psychiatric hospitals. I've had some time in the community mental health as well as crisis centers and in education. All that to say, I've really just got the privilege to walk alongside children and families for a very long time, just helping them grow and be their best self. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to offer what we have and spend the next 90 minutes with you guys. I'll turn it over to let Bethany introduce herself.
Thank you, Cheryl. My name is Bethany Nold, and I am the Program Development Coordinator for Camber Children's Mental Health. I am clinically licensed in the state of Kansas. I have worked for KVC Camber for coming up on 11 years now. I worked on the foster care, aftercare reintegration side for 2 years, doing in-home preventative care to ensure reintegration was viable. And then I moved to work at our Kansas City inpatient acute program, and I worked as an inpatient therapist for 8 years. In my role at Camber, I do a lot of research and a lot of staff education. I have a pretty diverse experience working in trauma, both perpetrators and victims of trauma, and I like to practice privately. So I got a lot of hats, similar to Cheryl. So I look forward to teaching you guys about boundaries today.
Awesome. So as we get started today, research tells us we only remember about 10, maybe 20% of what we're going to go over today in the next 90 minutes. So I just want to encourage you to take notes. Feel free to be active in our chat, capture our screen grabs, jot down ideas. And our hope is that you walk away with, a few things that can really stick with you and make a difference for you personally and professionally. So let's look at what we're going to learn today over the next 90 minutes. We're going to review the distinct types of boundaries and their functions. We're going to develop skills for teaching boundaries in age and context appropriate ways. We're going to increase understanding of how boundaries support healthy relationships and well-being, and strengthen the ability to uphold boundaries consistently and effectively. So let's get started today. You want to transition me to the next slide,
Yeah, uh-oh,
please?
it's frozen on me. Oh no. Okay. Well, I get kind of a
It wouldn't be
delayed.
a good presentation without some.
Oh no, we went way back.
Yeah,
Let me go way
yeah,
back.
you're
Okay.
okay. It's always, the
There we
love
go.
of technology.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Oh, wait,
Um,
hold on. Let
yeah,
me.
I think we're
There
on
we
the
go.
wrong
Now we're
slide.
there.
There, we're there. So, as helpers, community providers, and educators, and others who support people in our professional and personal settings, we're all familiar with boundaries. Boundaries are shaped by our social, cultural, and situational factors. We often talk about boundaries when something goes wrong, when they're unclear, not respected, or crossed. So let's look what this author says. They say boundaries are the limits we set for ourselves that help keep us safe, guide how we interact with our environment, and support healthy connections with others. This author talks about boundaries are built on the three C's: clear, concise, and calm. Clear. Identify your boundaries. Reflect on those situations where are needed with your clients, your colleagues, your supervisors, or even in your personal life. Concise. Express your boundaries to the point, brief. Calm. Communicate those boundaries with a steady, calm tone. Staying calm demonstrates confidence and assertiveness and encourages others to listen and respect your limits. I really like how Brene Brown talks a lot about boundaries. And so, if I could just use some of her language, I have found it to be one of the most helpful things when we're talking about boundaries. Brene Brown says boundaries are what's okay and what's not okay. Boundaries are about clarity and self respect, and they're not about controlling others. They're about communicating your limits, defining what you will and won't accept in relationships. She also goes on to say, daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even if we risk disappointing others. Setting boundary is an act of self-worth, not selfishness. In fact, clear boundaries often build stronger and more respectful relationships. And she uses these three things that I often find so easy to keep running in my brain. She says boundaries equal what I'm okay with, what I'm not okay with, and what I will do if the line is crossed. And so think about when you're setting a boundary, is it clear? Is it to the point? Are you able to stay calm? So I think of some examples of, like, especially if I'm working with maybe someone who's aggressive. I might say things like, I'm not for hurting or I'm not for hitting. If you do that, our time will be up if I'm working with a little. If it's a bigger one and I'm at risk to be hurt, I might say we'll have to call the police or somebody might join, but I will set very clear. I'm not giving a lot of explanation. So I love how this one keeps it so simple with those three C's: clear, brief, calm. I think of other things of, again, making sure that you're being seen clear. So I think sometimes we're often not direct enough, or to the point enough. And so, like, I'll just give a few more examples of, like, what I think of sexual behaviors. It's not okay to show other people your private parts. Again, I'm going to stay calm. I'm just going to recite it. It's brief. It's clear, and I'm going to make sure my body is managing that anxiety. It's not okay to use sexual language. That's another very clear, brief boundary there. It's not okay to make other people uncomfortable with your sexual language or maybe foul language or whatever that boundary is for you. One other thing I think of is like touch. It's not okay to touch other people, and it can be very specific. It's not okay to touch other people's private parts. It's not okay, and being very specific so the kid knows and understands very clearly what you are saying, and not just with kids, adults too. Thank you, Bethany. I'm going to
Thank you
turn it
for
over to you.
that. Yeah, guys, sorry, my trigger finger, or I accidentally touched the touchpad and then the slide moves. So please bear
You're,
with me.
you're doing
So in order to understand boundaries, we need to talk about how they develop. And so what we know is that boundaries develop through early attachment experiences, family interaction styles, the reinforcement of autonomy versus dependence. And so, like, a good example of this would be, when your child reaches an age where they are able to make a snack or get something for themselves. And so an autonomy would be allowing them to do age appropriate things that you've kind of coached them through versus like dependence, which is keeping everything very strict and guarded and having like rules, right? That they have to ask you for things. Um, Boundaries are also learned through repeated relational dynamics and learned behaviors. And so this can be good and bad, right? These are positive behaviors, these are unhealthy family dynamics. Boundaries impact the family system impacts boundaries. And so boundaries are shaped by the closeness and separation, how closeness and separation are managed. Children learn if emotional expression is safe or unsafe, and they learn that by responses to emotional expression. Early experiences will often determine how much independence is permitted. Differentiation. So when kids are growing to push those boundaries and expand themselves, that is either supported or discouraged, and that really influences adult relational styles. And so research conducted by Ryder and Bartle argued that boundaries function as the psychological distance regulators in emotions. Um, and I think it's just really important to remember how early these patterns start, and we'll talk about that in another slide because this starts from the moment you're out. So when we talk about boundary styles, I'm sure any clinician looking at this is pretty familiar with this concept. We have healthy boundaries, which are like a filter that filters some things out and lets some things in. We have porous boundaries, which is everything's getting in. It's not an effective filter. And then we have rigid boundaries where nothing is coming out or in. And I've always found this to be the easiest way to explain boundaries to patients, parents, clients. And if we break this down, porous boundaries allow too much, too many people, too many demands, too many situations. There's just so many gaps. Whereas a healthy boundary filters out some, but also allows some in. And so there's a balance of people, situations, interactions, and that's how it becomes an effective filter. Rigid boundaries really close the filter off. And so nothing is coming out or in. And it might seem like at times that's the best way to function. And we do that when we don't want to feel vulnerable, but that style of boundary doesn't permit people to see us, to ask us for help, offer help, or for people to come in when we need them. And so you really do have to have a balance. And it's important to note that boundaries can vary based on the relationships or the context. So, like, certain boundaries are pretty consistent across settings, and some of them are very dependent on the context. So, elaborating more on this research, Ryder and Bartle disagreed with the simplified lens of boundaries, like I discussed in the previous setting. So they said, no, it's way more complicated. They broke down boundary styles as healthy, diffused, or rigid, which is disengaged. They stated that rather than viewing boundaries as simple, rigid, or diffused, they conceptualized them as as dynamic mechanisms to manage closeness, intimacy, autonomy, and separateness between individuals. Again, although this is very similar to the previous slide, this group of researchers felt like it was much more dynamic than that. Boundaries are also not static traits. They are interactional processes that shift depending on the relational context. And so what is consistent between these two slides is that healthy boundaries, like Cheryl said, are clear, but they can be flexible. They allow for closeness without loss of self, and they support an individuality within intimacy. So they support a good connection without taking away someone's identity. The diffused or enmeshed boundaries are too much. A good enmeshed boundaries is always like your mother-in-law or your in-laws, right? Like overly involved, kind of taking ownership of your relationship. There's a lot of emotional fusion. And the disengaged boundary is an emotional cutoff, excessive independence. And often that is a defense mechanism, excessively independent because we've been let down, right? People have hurt us. And so if we just don't rely on anybody, then it's not a problem. I wish it worked that way. And limited intimacy, so limited connections. So where do these boundaries come from? They come from our families. They come from our early interactions. This research study again talked about how boundaries control how emotionally close or distant people are, and they balance autonomy and connection. And I think that's a theme here that's important to keep in mind. Your boundaries help you keep your sense of self in relation to your connections to others, and they do that by protecting your self identity and influencing levels of intimacy, dependency, and differentiation. And so those three things, when you're dealing with someone who has had a lot of hurt, who has not had good boundaries modeled for them, or had boundary violations, sometimes we really see that blur in the intimacy, dependency, and differentiation. And healthy relationships allow boundaries to be flexible, and individuals can move further apart or closer together based on the needs or the circumstances. John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth discussed boundaries and how patterns develop primarily through our early attachment experiences. So right out of the gate, from the womb to the front lines. And they said that our early attachment experiences can influence what interaction styles happen within our families. And it really comes down to what behaviors were reinforced. Was the child rewarded for autonomy or for independence? Were their needs met consistently? Were they allowed closeness to their family systems? And when we look at family systems, we see boundaries shaped by how the family navigated the delicate balance of closeness and separation. As children grow, they constantly learn the rules of relationships, and and they're learning, is it safe to express my emotions? Is independence allowed here? Is being different from my family supported or discouraged? And those early lessons are powerful because they directly influence the relational styles that we carry into adulthood. So when I was researching this topic, I found like multiple lists of types of boundaries, some upwards of like 12 to 15. And so I stuck with the 6 consistent themes that I saw across the research, which is physical boundaries. So that's the boundary type in relation to physical space and touch. Sexual boundaries, and that refers to whom and how you express your sexuality. Emotional, which is your feelings, how you express them and communicate them. Material, which refers to like how you use your money and possessions. Intellectual, which refers to ideas and thoughts. And time, which refers to how much and how you spend your time. And so I also noticed consistent themes of boundaries, other boundary types like spiritual, digital, or geographical boundaries. But like I said, I kept it short with the 6 because it was what was most simply recognized. And that said, how we teach these concepts matter. When working with the individuals we serve, we need to adapt our language and examples. A child's understanding of a material boundary may look very different from an adult. So we always want to filter these concepts through a developmental lens when we're teaching others about them. So let's talk about the developmental understanding of boundaries. So in the beginning, boundaries start from the time at the moment you're of the time you come out, right? And so that's when you're learning your physical and early emotional boundaries. And that's where we're learning bodily autonomy, self-differentiation, and early emotion regulation. And so we see this with new parents, right, that are working on learning that co-regulation. In that 3 to 5 age range, we introduce the concept of material. And so then we get the personal space, feelings labeling, mine versus yours, and basic privacy. And so that is when your toddler takes over your home and everything you own, if you're a parent, and then that 6 to 10 age range is where we add in emotional, intellectual, and time. And so that's really the perspective taking, respecting others' opinions and schedules, and emerging emotional responsibility. And so that's when we start to introduce this concept of responsibility. So, responsibility of your own emotions and awareness of how your behaviors and your emotions impact others. Once we go into the 11 to 14 age range, emotional, intellectual, and time, we see increased desire for privacy, forming independent beliefs, and negotiating autonomy. And so that's when kids begin to express themselves with beliefs and interests that may be different from their families or their parents, and they want autonomy. So that's where we're negotiating being able to go in the store by ourselves or being able to use the oven and things like that. In that 15 to 18 age range, we add in the sexual component along with emotional, time, and material. And so it's kind of ironic that in the 15 to 18 age range, we keep what was originally going on in the 11 to 14 age range, but we add in the sexual component. And so that's the consent awareness, balanced intimacy, managing commitments, and financial responsibility.
Hey,
And
Bethany.
yeah,
Oh, sorry. There was a question about sexual boundaries, so I didn't want you to
yeah.
get too far ahead of that. Someone's wondering, do you think we should develop sexual boundaries sooner than 15? I would think that would be in the 11 to 14 rather than 15 to 18 was their question.
So I think that is yes, and I think it starts under bodily autonomy. And so maybe the theme that we need to continue is bodily autonomy. Um, until we can developmentally, and this is, a research article, but I do think that maybe we need to probably start more at the beginning when we're talking about that. And so, like, this is your body, this is my body, and, helping kids understand, like, when somebody's touches all of those things. And then as it relates to their awareness of other people's bodies, then we start filtering in that information about the rules and boundaries for other people's bodies. So, absolutely, I think it does need to happen earlier.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Someone also asked, would these developmental expectations be different if there are neurodiversity considerations such as ADHD?
Yeah, absolutely. And that again, kind of knowing your audience, knowing who you're working with, developing, supporting, you might want to start integrating more of these boundaries, especially as it relates to impulse, right? So, again, space, time, physical boundaries. And those are also things that may need to continue to develop across context, because sometimes we compartmentalize those boundaries. Our neurodivergent youth sometimes function in a sense where they cope and manage their day to day by putting everything in a compartment. And so you may have to help them kind of broaden their filing cabinet, right? To help anticipate those things and also manage impulses, because impulses are what unfortunately sometimes makes us cross boundaries.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what we know is healthy development requires flexibility of caregivers. Children don't learn any specific numerical list of boundaries. They gradually develop these capacities in different domains. As cognitive ability increases, as emotional regulation matures, identity consolidates, and social experience expands. And so if you are supporting, growing, helping a child that may be advancing in some of these areas or may be behind in some of these areas, it's important to adapt and kind of model boundaries to fit what their understanding is, to make sure that they understand. So relational patterns of boundaries. So this is where we kind of talk about the developmental understanding. So relational patterns of boundaries mean it can be like a difficulty saying no or prioritizing yourself over others. So these are what it looks like when we're not having good boundaries. One-sided relationships where we absorb one another's emotions. Self-awareness issues, so struggling to name feelings and thoughts or make decisions, or finding yourself in situations where others appear to know you more than you know yourself. That is not always a positive thing. That can be a sign of a greater concern, domestic violence, toxic relationships. And again, these are all how these patterns can develop in an unhealthy way. With emotion regulation, emotions may feel overwhelming, or you might find yourself to be completely numb. Intrusive thoughts or body sensations, or difficulty concentrating, poor self-trust or autonomy. So repeat mistakes, low confidence and own judgment, relying on others to define your reality, and allowing others to take without reciprocity. And so this development of unhealthy boundaries can start from adverse experiences during developmental stages. And I found this quote that I really liked that said, all forms of abuse represent a profound invasion of personal boundaries. Consequently, survivors often grapple with a deep sense of powerlessness regarding their physical safety and life choices. And so I think that's pretty profound because that does really explain how these things just kind of ripple effect on. And so when we look at like the developmental progression pattern of boundaries, physical, emotional, intellectual, sexual, concrete, and then we get to abstract and relational boundaries, and externally regulated and internally regulated. And so when things are going well, ideally they follow some semblance of this. And when things aren't going well with the development of boundaries, we start to see these concessions being made at the first box on the slide. So now we're gonna talk about teaching boundaries and differentiating rules between boundaries. So I'm sure at some point, all helping professionals, educators, or supportive individuals have acted in a situation where they were mediating a conflict where rules were being used as boundaries or vice versa.
Hey, Bethany, I'm
Yeah,
so sorry. Could you repeat that quote again?
yeah.
Thank you.
So consequently, oh no, all forms of abuse represent a profound invasion of personal boundaries. Consequently, survivors often grapple with a deep sense of powerlessness regarding their physical safety and life choices.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk about, like I said, the difference between rules and boundaries. So in behavior science, we know rule-governed behavior means you do something because the rule tells you what will happen or what to do, even if you haven't had that experience yet. And so the example of this would be if you're cooking at a higher altitude, you have to boil an egg longer. Now, you may not know that for sure from experience, but if you're in a situation where you've been advised to do it that way, you're probably going to do it that way. And so you can change what you do, but you can also accept this input because it likely came from trial and error. So boundaries and rules, what's the difference? Both of them aim to protect and respect, but they work in different ways. boundaries are self-governance. So if there's like one thing that you take from this, I want you to remember boundaries are self-governance. And what that means is the focus on what I will and won't tolerate, like Cheryl had previously stated. They are self-directed and self-enforced. So again, what/will do if a boundary is crossed. Boundaries can be flexible and internal. And examples of this look like, I won't stay in this conversation where I'm being yelled at, or if this continues, I'll need to take some time away. So giving them an option, expressing what you will and won't tolerate and allowing an option for the behavior to change during the interaction, that's what we mean by flexibility. And then rules, the governance of others. So boundaries, governance of self, rules, governance of others. And so that focuses on what you must and must not do. And that's externally enforced through pressure, persuasion, punishment. It's often rigid and unilateral or compliance-based. So this is rule style language. And a compliance-based example is the speed limit. If you're speeding, you're going to get in trouble, right? That's a compliance-based example of enforcing that rule. So examples of this in language would be, you're not allowed to go out drinking without me. So you're not allowed to engage in a behavior without me. Or you must text me every hour while you're out. So you can see I use some examples from like relationships that may not always be healthy. The important nuance is that rules are not automatically bad. They can be mutual agreements that are co-created and healthy. The problem is when rules are imposed by one person to control the other. And that's really where we start to see things decline. And that's often where I see parents, when we're doing family therapy, kind of losing sight of the objective in an effort to try to enforce some compliance, because compliance makes us feel in control. Oh, here. And I'll hand it back to Cheryl.
All right. Thank you, Bethany. So we are back and we're looking at teaching boundaries, setting our expectations early. So prevention, not punishment. So the APA guidelines, that goes on to say that boundaries are most effective when we set them up at the start of the relationship, supporting both the provider's well-being and the client's learning of healthy relational norms, because they're learning from us, right? Why does this matter? Early boundary setting strengthens the therapeutic alliance and helps clients learn how to build healthy relationships. Setting clear expectations up front helps us teach and model boundaries for the populations we serve. So think about that as providers when we're doing our therapy, especially if we've been doing it a long time. Are we setting the boundary of a mandated reporter? If you tell me that there's been abuse or neglect or suicide, that you're going to hurt someone, that I am required to inform someone, that they know that before they ever disclose anything to me, so that I don't damage that relationship. If they do disclose, I've got to say, hey, I've got to hotline that. And remember when we talked about that in our first session? Do we talk to them about our guidelines for social media? I'm not going to be your friend on Facebook or TikTok. Are we talking to them about how we're going to respond to emails and phone calls? Like, where do you stand? Like, I would often tell people, you can send me all the emails and voicemails. I'll read them, I'll listen to them, but we're not going to respond to them or talk about them until our next session. And in our session, we're going to go over your emails and your phone calls. And so again, so that they're not hurt in that relationship and they know from the very beginning, this is how I'm going to respond. This is what's okay with me, what's not okay with me. The other thing is expectations for interactions in public or social settings. What if we see each other at Target? What if our kids go to the same school? What if they want to invite me somewhere? Have I gone over all of those things before we ever start a relationship? Again, so that it's preventive and they're not feeling punished or rejected, because from the very beginning we said, here's what's okay and what's not okay in our therapeutic relationship. relationship. So I think it's so important. And I think sometimes the longer we've done it, we often can so forget those things until afterwards. And then it does feel like a punishment. And we're not setting the example of healthy relational norms. So again, set up those expectations early. Think of it as preventative, not punishment. It goes on this slide. We'll talk about really quick how to teach it. We talk about boundaries at the beginning, so there's no surprises later, kind of like what I just mentioned. We don't want them to not know something and then we have to tell them later. Boundaries are to protect both people in the relationship. It's not just for me, it's also for them. So I think this is a great takeaway of prevention, not punishment. And more than anything, I think we're always setting that healthy relational norm for who we're working with. Again, but I'll also say this goes along in our professional careers. It goes along in our personal lives as well. So it's something that's so important as we go and we work throughout our day-to-day lives. You want to transition me slides? Thank you. So teaching boundaries. Boundaries are self-care that reduce the burnout risk. So think about that. Boundaries are self-care that reduce burnout risk. They help protect the quality of care. How to teach it. A boundary is how to protect my time, my energy, capacity so that I can show up well. So she has two examples here. And before I share those, I just want to share a little bit also, because whenever I talk about boundaries, Brene Brown always comes to my mind. Her quotes, as I'm constantly reading and engaging in her books, are just burned there. And I think it goes right or wrong. So one of the things Brene Brown says is, what boundaries need to be in place for me to be in my integrity and generous with my assumptions about the intentions, words, and actions of others? Oh, that one always gets me. Like, what boundaries do I need to have in place for me, my responsibility, my integrity and generosity, so that I can think well of them? Because oftentimes when I'm thinking, oh, this person's driving me crazy, or oh, I don't like this client, I don't want to see them, or I'm feeling really frustrated with a client, or maybe professionally, your peers or your supervisor, it's about me recognizing that for me to be like, oh, something's off. It's something that I'm responsible for. And to take that deep breath and to realize that I probably needed to provide really clear expectations and boundaries. And Brene Brown just teaches this so well. So it has been something that whenever I'm feeling that, or like resentment, or, oh, I don't really want to do this, or I'm avoiding it, it has now become my trigger to always ask, what's going on? Am I frustrated? Have I gave clear expectations? Have I set good boundaries? And if not, that's my cue to go back and have what I like to say is a redo and go back and be like, I am so sorry. I didn't do a good job of setting expectations, or I didn't do a good job of setting the boundary, and owning that. And I like to say have a do-over and then talk about those expectations or boundaries so that I can, if it goes back to that first quote, right? So that I can be in my integrity and generosity with my assumptions of them, of their intentions, their words, and their actions, right? Because if I don't put those boundaries in place, my brain can just go wild thinking about, oh, this person was doing this because of this, or their words mean this, or they're doing this because I didn't set good expectations or boundaries. So this one is a no-brainer. It's something that I constantly keep in front of me because it is so true of our day-to-day life, whether that be professionally, personally, or working with clients. So I hope that could be a good takeaway for you. That is one that I have sure pocketed for well. Brene Brown also goes on to say, if a behavior is not okay, we set a boundary. If a behavior is not okay, we set a boundary. And she gave these examples. I know this is a tough conversation. Being mad is okay. Yelling is not. So again, it goes back to that clear, very direct, and staying calm. Instead of yelling back at them, I'm going to acknowledge that. I know this is a tough conversation. Being mad at me is okay, but yelling is not. Another example she has is, I know we're tired and stressed, and this has been a long meeting. Being frustrated is okay. Interrupting people and rolling eyes is not okay. Another example is, I appreciate the passion around the different opinions and ideas. The emotion is okay. We can all feel strongly here. But passive aggressive comments and put downs are not okay. So again, we can reset ourselves when we're finding ourselves really anxious or being upset or frustrated. What boundaries need to be put in place so that I can be in my integrity and generosity, so that my assumptions of you and your attentions, your words and your actions can be well. So here's a couple other examples, like when teaching this. Bedtime boundary. Adults say, I am not answering work emails until after 8 p.m. Why? Because being mentally present at bedtime improves connection. The teaching point is when I protect my time, I protect my relationships. Yes, are you being resentful that you are doing emails when you want to be putting your kid to bed? That's your clue when you're feeling that to say, what boundaries do I need to have in place? The boundary is, I'm not going to look at work emails after this time. Clear, calm. It's not when you're full of emotion and you're yelling. The other example on here is emotional capacity. Adult notices they're overstimulated and says, I need 10 minutes of quiet before we talk about this. The teaching point is pausing prevents snapping. Yes, pause. Even if like someone's asking, always take the pause to regroup, settle yourself so that you can be calm in the midst of all that is going on. All right, you want to transition slides for me? There, I think we skipped one. It's the adults. There we go. Thank you. Our love of technology, it's always a thing, right? So teaching boundaries regarding adults. Boundaries should be value-based, not compliance. Compliance trap that Bethany talked about earlier. Boundary decisions should be based on core personal values rather than defaulting to compliance based on expectations. Compliance traps, as Bethany had spoke about earlier. You can practice this by pausing before making decisions using language that allows values to re-enter your decision. A compliance trap is when we say yes because we feel guilty or pressured, not because it fits my value or capacity. Oh, Brene Brown talks a lot about this too. So again, how can you operate in your values and capacity? It doesn't mean other people do, but what are your values? Know your values so that you can stay true to who you are. One example is guilt-based yes. Other people sign up for everything. Oh, I hear this professionally. And the parent thinks, I should do it too. They're all doing it. Instead, pause. Does this fit my personal priorities right now? Oh, it's so hard to do to take that pause. Example two, family value check. The value is family dinner time. The request is a late meeting. The decision, I'm unavailable after 6. The 3-step boundary filter, pause, let me think about that. And again, you've got to practice that because it can be so hard if you haven't gotten into practice about being able to say, hold on, I need to think about that because we often can feel pressure, anxiety, and we want to respond right now. But it is 100% okay to say, let me think about that. I'll get back to you. Ask, do I have the energy for this? Does this match my values? Will I resent this later? Oh, think about when we make our decisions, if we took a moment just to pause and ask something of these questions to ourselves, because they might be really great things, but they might not be what's best for you. So it doesn't mean what you're being asked or maybe what it is wrong. It could be really great things, but it's not what's best for you. And it's okay to not do that. I love it says, do I have the energy for this? I'm always asking, even in my professional, when I'm asking the people I work with, does this give you energy or does it drain you? Like when we're thinking about assigning tasks or who's going to take what responsibility, is trying to drive it through that lens of does this give you energy? Does this match your values? Before we're asking to take on to do that. So again, I love those. Again, I can't help it but give another little Brene Brown that always sticks in my head. Is she says a big driver to numbing and resentment. So when we are numbing ourselves, TV, food, caffeine, addiction, when we're numbing ourselves or we're resentment, almost always relates back to the lack of boundaries. Oh, when we're numbing or we're feeling resentful, she's saying it almost always relates back to a lack of boundaries. So when I am feeling that I'm wanting just to numb out, or I'm feeling really resentful, I go back to that same question. What boundaries do I need in place to operate within my integrity and generosity? Those are those triggers that
Yeah.
help me be like, oh, that's happening right now. What do I need to do? All right. You want to transition me
Yeah,
slides
just
again? Go ahead.
well, I just wanted to add something. I think when you practice the boundary filter, you're also going to find out very quickly in what areas you haven't been practicing this. So when you stop agreeing and start implementing, you may experience some pushback or some feedback, right? And so it's important to
Yes.
keep that in mind. You're going to find out, oh, I need to have more boundaries in this context or in this situation or in this relationship pretty quickly when you
Yes.
start actually implementing these skills.
We have just a couple
Absolutely.
questions.
Yeah.
And again, if you guys are going to get to this, I tried to scan ahead, but um, how can you support a client with social media utilizing therapy talk or providing the wrong definition or context for topics such as boundaries? For example, a client will block someone if they don't respond to them in a day because that's their
Mhm.
boundary. So the client has said, if they don't respond to me in a day, I'm blocking them, even though, as Bethany described, that's not actually a boundary, but that's fine. Go ahead.
Yeah, as my little therapeutic cat, and Bethany might have something else to add, is I would want to dig in farther about what that is, that sense of rejection that they need to do that. That's where I would go of
Yeah,
what has happened in their life that feels so painful that somebody hasn't got back to you in that time frame. That
I
I
would
don't,
yeah, sorry, Cheryl. I
no,
I would
please.
ask, do you have the same rigid expectations for relationships IRL that you do online? So is this something you specifically hold your friends in the digital space to? What and ask them like what's the justification for that? How did this come to be developed? And like what's their desired outcome? So is the desired outcome to have people that are constantly engaging with you? And is that, in my mind, that could go a lot of ways, like into a situation where we're using this to have fulfillment for lack of.
You muted
Oh,
yourself. Sorry.
sorry. Yeah, I would want to know if we have the same expectations for all relationships, or is it just in the digital space, and how that developed, and like what kind of expectations do we have from these relationships where we're, being so rigid about our communication expectations.
Yeah, I also go back to be like, tell me more about that. I would really want to understand underneath of why she put that into place and
Yeah.
what is that about? Yeah, I would really want to know more about why she made that decision and how yeah, yeah. Yeah.
All right, thank you. The next questions are about teens, and I know we're getting to that next, so I'll let you guys do that, and then I'll ask those questions.
I
Okay,
just
perfect.
wanted
Yeah.
to chime in with one thing that was said in the chat. It's
Yes.
not a question, but I think is we were kind of just touching on social media. I think that also the social media, they talked about the comparisons that come with social media and how that affects our ability to set boundaries and where maybe we feel really confident about a boundary, but then we're trying to compare. And so I didn't know if you guys had any commentary other than just like that is something that I think is affects this vastly and consistently and something we always have to be aware of.
So when you say
Yeah.
comparison, are you talking about like comparing yourself to others?
That's how I took it when I was reading the chat, just like kind of like how, maybe I do think that I have a boundary for something and then but someone else is setting a different boundary and it's somebody that I admired through a
Yeah.
parasocial relationship or something like that. And so I think that that's kind of an interesting topic as
we
well.
we talked about this in a previous webinar, but comparing yourself to others is developmentally appropriate. It's how we learn, right? And so I always, when we talk about any sort of comparison, I always run it through the lens of, is it an upward comparison or a downward comparison?
Yes.
So are we using it from the perspective of like upward? So like I I want to work out more and I really admire this person and I want to look better. I want to be in shape. And so you can either make that an upward where you use it to grow, and so you start being more active or doing things to help you reach that goal. Or you can do a downward, which is where you just say, I want to look like them and I never will, and you don't use it to motivate yourself forward.
Yeah, I think one of the other things is I think a lot about psychoeducation. And depending on the age of the kid, is it best to get your information off of the internet, and why that's not your best way to get information and how it's not always truthful. So I think a lot about psychoeducation. I also think a lot about their self-worth and what's happening underneath of there. So, but I would still go back to, I do a lot of psychoeducation. There's a lot of great research out there on what social media does, and even just screen time in general. I do know that's the hardest battle with parents because they just have a hard time saying no. And I'll just say personally, like, I don't give my kid a phone. She's in eighth grade and she thinks I'm the worst parent ever because she's the only kid without a phone. But I just stand solidly on that research for kids and brain development. And I'm not shaming or guilting anybody who does it. And it's hard to really say no to something that other people do. But man, there's a lot of even brain scans out there of what it does, even like depression, anxiety. Man, there's a ton of research on there. So I like to go to a lot of psychoeducation. So it's not about my opinion, but here's what some research backed evidence is of that. And then talking about how to safeguard that, and then who are trusted people that are human beings that they could talk about this with instead of going to the internet. Again, depending age appropriate, how much or little you go. But that was my first thought.
And also, I think if if the internet is inevitable, trying to really teach them how to be curious and skeptical so that they aren't digesting information that they perceive as fact that isn't fact or is inaccurate, like the person that posed the question said. You may have to go the lens of teaching them how to distinguish truth from fact, and understanding like how these systems work,
Yeah.
within the algorithm and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions, or should we go ahead and transition to our next slide?
The questions I have are for teens, so we can cover those when you've already talked about them.
All right. Sounds good. Bethany, you want to transition me? All right, thanks. So teaching boundaries, self-care for youth and teens. A boundary is a limit to set to protect my feelings and energy so that I can be my best self. Here's some examples. Social energy. A child says, I want to go home now. Teach, it's okay to leave before you're exhausted. Youth example 2 is physical boundary. I don't like being tickled. Stop. Teaching them that your body, your rules. Another example is group chat at midnight situation. Friends expect instant reply at all hours. The boundary is I don't answer messages after 10 p.m. Sleep is self-care, and you don't owe anyone 24/7 access to anyone. Emotional dumping situation. A friend vents daily for hours. The boundary is I care about you, but I can't talk about this every night. And the teaching point is you can care about someone without carrying their stress. So again, we are role modeling, we are setting those, we are doing them, and we are helping our kiddos learn how to be able to do that. Even our examples that we gave sexually at the start, it's not okay to show your private parts. It's not okay to make me uncomfortable with your sexual behavior. Again, teaching them that. And again, I'll go back to Brene Brown probably every time because I think she keeps it so simple and sweet. What's okay and what's not okay. And it's okay to say what's okay with you. Susie over here might like to be tickled and it doesn't bother her. You do not like it, and it's okay to set the expectation that you don't want to be tickled. And there's nothing wrong with that. And you don't have to give an explanation. I don't want to be tickled. Please don't do that. Brittany, do you want to throw out some of those questions?
Absolutely. So someone was asking any advice or techniques with tweens and teens who are sacrificing their boundaries because they are quote unquote desperate for intimacy or friendship. Some of this seems to stem from attachment issues, and in another case, neuro differences inhibiting close social relationships. So a couple of examples.
Yeah. Bethany, did you have something?
Yeah, could you repeat that, Brittany? Sorry, you kind of cut out on me there.
Not a problem. Um, Advice or techniques for teens and tweens who are sacrificing their boundaries because they're desperate for like friendship and intimacy. They gave two examples. One, it seems to stem from attachment disorder, and the other is due to like neuro differences inhibiting close social relationships.
So at the core, it sounds like we're kind of sacrificing our values to try to have a connection. And so I mean, I would like sometimes, if someone, falls under that neurodivergent spectrum, they're going to rely on a lot of evidence. Those are our clients, our patients that really take in their environment and cite that for rationale for things. And so I might go the approach of trying to like understand if they perceive that what they're doing is working. So if they can tell you I'm violating my boundaries or I'm compromising on my beliefs in order to have this connection, did it feel like it worked? If you look at this from like the evidence perspective, right? So what, do I have evidence to suggest that this is working? If I do, at what cost? And so sometimes breaking it down, I do that a lot with like patients that have ADHD. Those are my patients that need evidence. They need to reference other like experiences. And so I will try to break down like you're doing it. Is it working? If it is, at what cost? Um, so does that cost outweigh the benefit, right? Um, and is it something you feel like you can keep up? So let's say you feel really dedicated to doing things this way. Can you keep it up? Or may there be a time where you can't? And then do you think this person will still want to be your friend if you set like this precedent or this expectation? So yeah, that's kind of how I process those things with clients. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, and what I go to is what is their trauma history, especially when it comes to attachment. And a lot of time there has to be a lot of psychoeducation about when these bad, sad, and scary things happened, your warning bells stopped working. And let's talk about how we can get those warning bells working and talking about what a healthy relationship is. And I think there is so many like experimental things that you can do instead of all just talking about it too. And I think if you did a quick Google search, you could probably find a ton of activities. I'm thinking of a handful if we're doing it. But so much of them is they really just may never been taught. Bethany talked about earlier the developmental. Like you can let's say you get an older kid, but they are functioning at a much lower age, is they could have never been taught, and you've got to teach them. So I think there's a whole lot in there not knowing the situation, but I definitely consider developmental, trauma history, attachment, a lot of psychoeducation so that they can understand and recognize that they're not bad or wrong, or that they're okay and that this is a normal struggle of what happens. And gosh, when you think about middle school, that's such a time of insecurity and your body changing and your hormone. So I just try to take that whole big picture in, and be able to navigate depending upon the situation. Because ultimately, right, we're trying to guide them to gain that insight. So I don't know if I went the right direction with that either, but that's what kind of came to my mind.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Thank you both. And I love those questions, Bethany, like at what cost and can you keep it up? That makes a lot of sense. Some other questions, and these are kind of related, so I'll ask them kind of together, and then I can repeat as well. So one person's asking, how can we teach or support a teen to make their own boundaries with their parents? And then how do we continue to strengthen young clients' self-autonomy in setting their body boundaries when parents or siblings or extended family do not follow? For example, with the tickling, family members don't stop. Child learns their words do not matter. So hitting, biting, kicking continues. So a couple of questions there about boundaries with teens and boundaries with children and families.
So I think with parents and teens, like I had said, I've been in a lot of family meetings, family therapies where we're talking at length about the rules versus the boundaries. And so I think when you're trying to, get everybody on the same page with the teenager and their parents, it's important to like talk about the rules versus the boundaries. So like what are the actual rules? Um, and then like what is the boundary? So if the rule is you have to be home by 11 and the boundary is if you're not home and I don't hear from you by 11:15, I'm gonna lock the door, right? And so really trying to distinguish like these are general rules we have to hold you to because this is how society functions versus these are our personal boundaries. And so I've had this conversation with clients, patients before when it comes to like vapes. And so having parents explain like it's not just like our personal preference that you not have a vape. It's illegal for you to have one at your age, right? That's a law. That's a rule. It's a law. Like we can't do anything with it. And so our boundary is if we see you with it in our home, we're going to take it away. And that's our boundary because we don't believe you should have it. We value your health, your well-being, and we don't think you should have it. And so maybe breaking things down, because sometimes if you literally walk teens through things, I mean, you would be surprised at how often they just think that parents can make concessions for things and they don't realize that's like sometimes parents are holding them to the bare minimum standards of the legal system. So breaking it down like that. And then if if the teen poses like a specific boundary, being able to like hear them out and be flexible with them. So don't get frustrated with their pushback and respond in like a forced compliance way, which is like if a teen says, I'm not comfortable with you going through my phone, you can't be like, well, I bought it. And so I'm going through it. You have to hold their hand and walk them through the fact that they are your responsibility. You have to help keep them safe. It's not just about them. So not responding in that like, cut it off, lack of flexibility, compliance trap type of way. I think with regard to the question about the child whose family doesn't respect their boundaries, I think that's a tough one. The only feedback I would have would be for them to be clear about like what they can do. So if your family is constantly gonna like want to touch you, like, hey, like, are you okay with a hug or a side hug or a high five? So you can, make clear like this is what I'm okay with. And so when I see them coming at me, like they're gonna tickle me or do whatever, I can be like, hey, how about a high five? To try to condition them to respond differently. That would be my suggestion for that.
Yeah, the only thing I was thinking of too is one, you might have to do some individual work with the kiddo and the family separately before you bring them together so that you're prepping them well. The other thing I think about is if family isn't respecting that, to really meet with that family without the kiddo and try to drill that down a little bit more of why they're not respecting that. So again, I think there's a whole lot of depends in there, of course. And then walking through, again, I'll go back to a lot of psychoeducation on boundaries and why it's important. So again, that might be such a really simplified answer, but that's really where my head went to on that question too.
Thank you. I think that first question about the teens um, is more about, and maybe I missed this piece, but more about the teen setting boundaries with parents. Is that possible? Um, and like, how would you support a teen in doing that?
Yeah, again, again, there's a lot of depends in here. There's not a one side way, but I think even like the example we gave early is, I know this is really tough. I know we have broken trust. It's okay to be mad at me, but how do we tell the team that's not okay to yell at me? It's not okay to roll your eyes at me. And so I really think about some individual work with that kiddo of how to show up and to set that. And then ultimately, you have to help that kid with some psychoeducation of knowing they can't control their parents because they can't. But if your parents do that, what can you do within the context of that relationship in that home so that that kiddo can remain calm? Because that's the goal, right? It's for that kiddo to be able to remain calm in the midst of the anxiety of setting their boundary, and they only have control over themselves. I don't know if that's what they're looking for, but that's where my head goes. And then I'll go back to a lot of time it could be the parents without the kiddo to help them understand. Again, I'll go back to psychoeducation. I'll use a wide range of things, a lot of experiential things, to try to help them grasp it in other ways outside of this specific dynamic because of the attachments that are going to be so different. But how does that play out, at work or in these other scenarios to try to help bring some connection? But that's where my head goes because at the end of the day, you can't control the parents just like they can't control the parents. And our job is to help that kiddo be able to distinguish what is okay and what is not okay.
Okay, thank you both so much.
Yeah.
And I
All
know
right,
we're
Bethany.
running low on time,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn it back over to Bethany.
So when we talk about teaching boundaries, it's important that we distinguish, values-based boundaries and avoid compliance traps. And so, like an example for youth, so somebody under that teenage would be doing someone else's homework. So the situation is the classmate says, just give me the answers or I won't be your friend. That's a compliance trap, right? So as a result, the youth shares the answers to avoid losing a friendship. Unfortunately, it's not a healthy relationship, right? So then we do the teaching moment, which is that real friends don't make you break rules. So again, making sure that we walk them through these rules that will not change. It's never going to be okay to cheat, right? And a friend wouldn't expect that of you because they wouldn't want you to compromise your values. Um, so a better response to practice would be, I could help you study, but I can't give you my answers. So a bid for connection. We can connect, we can share, but I can't, give you my answers. And the teaching point is that if you feel pressured, rushed, or scared to say no, pause, because that is often how you're finding yourself in a compliance trap, which is someone is trying to force you to comply, and going against like your values and the rules, right? So a teen example, which is peer pressure. So friends want to skip class. The pause skill would be, let me think about that. The values check would be, does this match who I want to be? And then the boundary is, I'm not going to skip. So not wanting to set the precedent that you are somebody that skips class or that people perceive you as somebody that breaks the rules. Another example is a relational peer pressure situation. So partner wants constant texting and location sharing. And this is happening now that our technology has advanced. And so it's important to have these discussions about this. But what's the values check? So do I value trust and independence? So do I value that they should believe me where I am, but I'm also my own person and I can go where I want and still respect our relationship. And so then the boundary would be that I'm not going to share my location. It's not necessary. And it's again, an attempt at forced compliance, right? So when we talk about boundary violations, we always got to talk about the professional standpoint. So when we name these by profession, so therapists, helping professionals, teachers, educators, these are boundary violations that we fall into where we're violating our own boundaries. So excessive self-disclosure, so sharing too much, right? And that self-disclosure is a fine line we have to walk where we do a little bit here and there, but we don't go all the way in. But at the same time, sometimes our clients need that. And so we can't always completely rule it out, but you really do need to walk that fine line. Another one is seeking reassurance from clients or students. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're seeking validation and direct feedback from the people that you help serve or educate, you're probably not filling your bucket in other healthy ways, right? Nobody wants a therapist to stop the session and be like, I'm a good therapist, right? Um, Fostering dependency, so extra contact or favors, or creating like a sense of specialness, or like your favorite client, your favorite student, your favorite whatever. That fosters dependency. And then countertransference acted out. So going out of your way to rescue, or finding yourself withdrawing or punishing the client when challenged. So when you start projecting and reenacting your own unhealthy patterns onto the person you're, again, teaching, supporting, educating, providing therapy to. Dual relationships or inappropriate contact. So special treatment, gifts, or private texting or direct messages outside of like the original agreed upon communication medium. So a therapist that has a work number and a home number, and we're messaging from our home number, buying gifts. Now, I know that this can be hard, especially for people that aren't necessarily therapists, but educators, when you see a child in need. And so sometimes it can be difficult to mediate this, especially if you see a child consistently struggling with like lack of access to supplies or something like that, and you want to buy something to make sure they have access. So that is a tough line to walk. I will say that it's not a black and white situation. Power and privacy misuse. So humiliation or coercion or inappropriate sharing of information. So this happens in hospitals, it happens in schools, it happens everywhere where we're serving someone or a population and we share private or personal information about them with someone else not connected to their team or whatever in a fashion that would be relevant for their care. And so that's a misuse of your power as a helper, educator, and it's like a misuse of their privacy. So additional examples, and these really apply to all professions, is confidentiality breaches. We all know what that is, right? Misuse of authority to access, so using systems and different things to look up people or things for personal reasons. Inappropriate personal conduct, so harassing them, retaliating against them, lashing out at somebody that expresses concern for your behavior, or making discriminatory remarks. So tips for remediation. So if you found that you have unintentionally crossed boundaries or broken rules, it's always important to acknowledge and document. So recognize what you did, apologize when appropriate, document objectively, and notify supervisors or ethics, per the policy of the organization that you're working within. Repair or reset the boundary. So clarify expectations, transfer care if you need to, or recuse yourself, and create a concrete plan to prevent this reoccurrence. And then get support, seek supervision and consultation. We sometimes when our bucket's not being filled, we unintentionally start to violate boundaries, and we could get that bucket filled within our interactions with our peers. So getting consultation, checking in with your supervisor, talking to people that do the work you do to validate your experience, so you don't start defaulting to the parties and populations that you serve and support for that feedback. So when we talk about, oh gosh, naming and managing boundary violations. So examples of violations are emotional rights. We just talked about that oversharing or expecting you to carry someone else's emotion, immediate replies. So that, like that person had asked that question, pushing you to get over it fast. So not allowing space for your emotions, expecting you to manage other people's emotions, or expecting you to carry theirs and your own, right? So a social would interrupting you, making plans without checking with your availability. So again, just not taking you into consideration. Physical violations, touch, taking your phone, invading your privacy, things that violate our privacy or our physical space. Professional, so taking credit for your work, pressuring extra tasks and ignoring workloads. Procedural, so ignoring required steps or rules. I really like this one because this is something I hadn't really thought of until I was working on this project. But we do see that, right? Like we have a procedure in place and we're dealing with a difficult situation, and somebody's trying to push us to like not go through our general procedure for handling a situation. And that's violating a boundary, right? That's a procedural boundary violation. Like we have this procedure in place for a reason, or this is our organization's policy on managing these things. And sometimes when we're working in a helping profession in a system with very limited resources, we find ourselves being pushed a lot to go against procedural professional boundaries like that. Um, and it's important to understand that boundary violations are shaped by context and personal patterns. So environmental pressures, family norms, workplace culture, community expectations, individual traits, temperament, attachment style, conflict avoidance, people pleasing. All of these things can increase your vulnerability to having boundaries crossed. Often when we interact with somebody that has really poor boundaries, if we meet their family, we can pretty quickly see how that has been embodied within their family system or within their organization or their community or culture. Sometimes culture, I mean, not sometimes, all the time, culture influences boundaries. And some cultures have not good boundaries in some areas and really rigid boundaries in other areas. Boundary violations and disruptions are common and they can erode boundary stability. So repeated intrusions, dismissing, guilt tripping, overstepping, coercion, or just breaking a small rule this one time weakens our ability to reinforce limits consistently, especially over time or in high stress situations. And so we can't only talk about boundaries when they've been violated. We have to talk about them all the time so that we know, you know, what we can expect or the frequency of which we're finding our boundaries pushed. We can't wait. We can't have a reactive approach to boundaries. We have to be very proactive. It needs to be an ongoing, fluid discussion. So I think it's important to remember that the motives for why people violate boundaries may be seeking intimacy and connection. So sometimes our clients may mistake our relationship for a friendship, a romance, or a personal companionship in reality, it's a professional relationship, right? But when you work professionally with someone and in the profession, you share a lot of things with each other, or you see them at their worst and at different stages, it's hard to not apply that the relationship is more close than it is. Sometimes clients engage in this behavior because they're reenacting trauma or past experiences. Clients may unconsciously repeat harmful dynamics familiar from earlier attachment or abuse. So again, they're doing what's been modeled for them. This can also look like testing limits and safety. So pushing a boundary to see whether or not you're going to give or stay consistent. And we see this in early child development and teens. I mean, that's pretty common in the as we grow and develop, we push things, right, to see what will happen. Sometimes clients may cross boundaries to seek affection or validation or control or a sense of being special, and that's an unmet need. So the motive is the unmet need. We're not getting our bucket filled in the other places with the people that are supposed to do that. Personality factors or disorders. So some clients have limited boundary awareness or repeatedly disregard interpersonal limits because of their underlying mental health diagnosis. So we know conditions where people really struggle with boundaries. We don't have to go into a whole dual diagnosis lesson, but there are certain psychological diagnoses where people tend to struggle more with boundaries, or impulses. And maybe it's not about lack of understanding of a boundary, it's the impulse control issue, right? Life crisis and stress. So major stress can reduce a client's ability to manage behavior appropriately. So an excessive amount of stress doesn't have us operating at 100%, and then we start to fall victim to these boundary violations. Misinterpretation of therapy. So clients may misunderstand professional care as an invitation for a more personal relationship. And again, if they have an unmet need in their interpersonal relationships, it's a lot easier to fall into that boundary violation. And so, what do these things look like in practice? They look like excessive contact, repeated messages, calls outside of like the proper channels for established communication, or the hours of established communication, despite being asked to follow what was initially established. So not communicating outside of a scheduled time, or communicating only through this format. Personal relationship requests. So they can just outright ask, can we be friends? Can we hang out? Can we connect? Intrusive questions about sexual behavior. So when a client, or somebody that you're serving, supporting, whatever the case may be, starts asking very personal questions about your life, making comments, that is a boundary violation, right? Gifts and favors. So again, gifts are hard. Gifts are very cultural. Gifts are very dependent upon the population served. So gifts are always going to be a really difficult gray area. But examples of this in practice look like offering money, expensive gifts. I think there's probably a difference between seeing your therapist run out of sticky notes and grabbing a pad the next time you're at the store to offer them, versus buying them a really expensive handbag, giving them discounts or offering them services or special deals in an attempt to connect with them further. So again, if they use any sort of self-disclosure against you, like if you happen to mention oh, we had a roof leak this weekend, that was kind of crazy. Anyway, how are you? And they work in that industry, they may be trying to connect with you. Disregarding professional limits. So that's when we're showing up unannounced. We're insisting on exceptions to the rules. We're not taking no for an answer. Manipulation and intimidation. So making threats. We see this a lot in the digital world, online, making threats, complaints, trying to guilt trip, splitting staff. I can't talk to you. I can't talk to them. I can only talk to you. You're the only one that understands me. Or trying to pit professionals against each other. So, well, the doctor said this, but the nurse said this, looking for ways to fracture, professional alliances. And so, yeah, it's a lot. There's professional, procedural, ethical, privacy, physical, emotional. There's multiple factors with regard to boundary violations. So I'm going to hand it back over to Cheryl.
Excellent. Thank you, Bethany. And for time's sake, you're just going to hear me kind of go through my next two slides quickly, so Bethany can round us out. What makes boundaries difficult? This slide will look at why boundaries can be difficult from a communication and empathy perspective, not just a behavioral one. The article highlights that boundaries get complicated because people don't always interpret each other the same way. Our ability to understand others is shaped by our different life experiences, different values or moral frameworks, different emotional sensitivity or triggers. Sometimes we hit what the article calls a limit in empathy, meaning it becomes hard to fully imagine someone else's perspective. This can lead to misunderstanding, even when no one is acting with bad intent. Moral differences can make someone else's behavior feel confusing or unacceptable. We don't always share the same reference point for what's normal or expected. Communication is harder without tone or body language or context, especially online or indirect communication. A lot of boundary conflict isn't about intention, it's about interpretation. Misunderstandings often come from missing context, not malice behavior. Boundaries help separate what belongs to me from what belongs to someone else. They clarify responsibility versus what's not my responsibility. So, part of what's making boundaries difficult is not just setting them, it's that we're all interpreting situations through a very different internal lens. If you want to click to my next slide. Thank you. So, a continuation from this article of what makes boundaries difficult is this slide looks at why boundaries can feel so difficult in practice, even when we intellectually understand them. He highlights the boundary challenges usually come from a few common patterns: people prioritizing others over themselves, uncertainty about what's appropriate or healthy, fear of damaging relationships, or a lack of experience seeing what a good, healthy boundaries actually look like. Boundaries often get confused with avoidance or rigidity. Healthy boundaries equal safe and connection, not withdrawal or shutting people out. Comfort versus safety. Just because something feels uncomfortable doesn't mean it's unsafe. Growth, vulnerability, and relationships repair can involve discomfort. It's okay to be uncomfortable. When boundaries are misused, they can become a way to avoid connection or create emotional distance instead of clarity. When overcorrected, too rigid, they can block flexibility, repair, and relationship growth. Healthy boundaries are about balance, protecting your own limits while staying in healthy relationship with others. The goal isn't fewer relationships or more distance, it's healthier, clearer, and more sustainable ones. So thanks for letting me run through those, and I'm going to pass it back to Bethany to round us out.
My keyboard has a mind of its own today, guys. So thank you for I think to wrap everything up, it's important to know that the purpose of boundaries is for safe, centered connection. And then we're asking, is this for the client's benefit or my own? Is this for someone else's benefit or my own? So holding boundaries means reflecting on what is for me versus what is for them. Boundaries come across a continuum. So crossings are minor departures versus actual violations that threaten the health or harm the relationship. And the tip is, if it's a gray area, pause, consult, and document. Expect ambiguity. Real life situations do not always match policy neatly. And that's how we end up with departures and violations. And so the tip is to weigh the client risk, the ethics, the policy, and alternatives before acting out. Use supervision and consultation early. Boundaries are really hard to see from the inside when you're on the inside. So having a fluid, ongoing conversation before we're fully boxed in. And the tip is to consult whenever you feel pulled to the rescue or to bend the rules or keep secrets. And lastly, don't rely on rules alone. A code of ethics is one guide. Context and agency expectations also matter. So the tip is to set limits clearly, limit brief, set limits clearly. So limit, brief, why, and alternate next step. So explaining the limit, providing a brief explanation, and discussing the next step. So thank you very much, everybody.
Okay, thank you. It's 1:30, and I'm sorry if we weren't able to get to all of your questions. There's just one more, and so I apologize, Faye, that we weren't able to answer that today. Jamie, I see that you've had your hand up for quite some time, so once I pause the recording, I will address that, or once I stop the recording, I will address that. I'm going to drop again in the chat the instructions for the certificate. Once you exit, the link should automatically pop up for you. You'll follow that link, fill out the survey, and your certificate will be generated and sent to your email. Please make sure that you type your email address incorrectly. Otherwise, it will get bumped back to me, and I got to dig through Zoom files and find you, but I do my best. That link will also be sent out again about 10 minutes from now. And if you have any questions, please do not email Alex Beineman. Email virtualevents@risecounselingkc.com. Putting that information one more time in the chat. And then I'm going to stop our recording.